Winston Churchill, when asked once about the merit of choosing government by democracy, responded, "It has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried." The Democracy Index, compiled by the Economist Intelligence Unit, EIU, estimates that only 22 countries in the world are true democracies. When assessed against a range of indicators that measure whether national elections are free and fair, the security of voters, the influence of foreign powers on government, and the capability of civil servants to implement policies. With 54 countries in the world being classed as authoritarian, or what we might call dictatorships. That is more than twice as many as those being seen as true democracies. The large remainder of countries being classed as either flawed democracies or hybrid authoritarian regimes. As we stand at the threshold of entering the third decade of the 21st century and survey the ability of governments to act and address the many pressing issues of our time, we may find ourselves with a depressingly low view of national leaders and governments' ability and willingness to address issues fairly and wisely, and so act in their people's best interest. Human government is flawed because humanity is flawed. And thus Churchill's comment holds true that even the democratic process is unable to guarantee good government, but nevertheless it's far better than any alternative. Therefore, knowing and recognising the limitations of human authorities to govern fairly may mean that many of us are surprised by this evening's reading that the Apostle Paul exhorts to willingly respect and obey the governing authorities, seemingly no matter what they're like. As we turn to tonight's passage, let me begin by saying this passage has been subject to much questioning, with some scholars even proposing that this text was added much later and not written by Paul. But there is no evidence for such a drastic interpretation. Chapter 13 fits perfectly well with the preceding chapter as Paul turns from the Christian's relationship to other Christians and to other individuals to think of ourselves as citizens within the state. He is moving on to how our views of God's mercy should transform our attitudes to the governing authorities, as he puts it in verse 1. I want to note as I begin tonight that I'm very grateful to the Christian minister and author Tim Keller for his book Romans for You, which I have drawn heavily from for tonight's talk. By the way, the For You series are very good for small group and individual study. And indeed, as a church, we have over the past few years drawn on Galatians for You, also by Keller, Judges for You as an evening sermon series in 2016, and at the end of last year, both Daniel for You and Colossians for You for our morning sermon series. So returning to the reading, Paul's focus in this short passage is how a Christian believer is to live as a citizen of his or her country. Paul shows us that the Christian is to view the state both positively and negatively, and in so doing, to show us the Christian's responsibility to the state. Paul says in verse 1 that every Christian is to be subject to the governing authorities, that is, to submit to the authority of civil government. Why? Well, three reasons. Firstly, because it is right to do so. God instituted the state and civil authorities under which we live. So as we see in the second half of verse 1, there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities have been established by God. Civil governments are installed by God, so deserving respect and submission. As we see in Daniel chapter 4 verse 17, it states, "The Most High," meaning God, "is sovereign over all the kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes, and he sets over them the lowliest of people." God is sovereign and in control, and Christian believers are to submit to the authorities that he's placed over them. Secondly, Christians are to submit to their governments because it is wise to do so, as God designed human society in this fashion. Paul is saying that governments are needed to hold people to account in order that people can live together. As we read in verse 3, do you want to be free from the fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right and you will be commended. Without the threat of punishment, human self-interest would make society impossible. So the very system of human government is a wise one instituted by God. As it says in the second half of verse 4, if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. The sword is the symbol of power to punish, to bring justice through prosecution, fines, imprisonment, and even death. Society would be in chaos, become like the Wild West of cowboy films, if all wielded the sword in their own interest. God's plan is only a few people bear the sword, those in authority. It's a tool of the authority, and therefore a tool for God. Thus, in essence, it is wise to submit to authorities, as their purpose is to hold its citizens to account, so that government and society can work successfully and social order can be maintained. Thirdly, we are to submit because it is fair to do so. Governing is hard work and takes dedicated resources. They, the governing authorities, fulfill their side of the bargain, and we, the citizens, are to fulfill ours. Hence in verse 6, this is also why you are to pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Now, all this talk of submission seems very absolute and is made even starker when considered along with verse 2, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. And this becomes even stronger when we remember that Paul is writing to the believers in Rome, who were under a totalitarian government that was becoming increasingly hostile to the church. And of course, this is not dissimilar to what many Christians elsewhere in the world today face. So is Paul really exhorting the Christian is always to submit to every authority, no matter what the circumstance? Well, this passage, there are a couple of indications, or as Tim Keller calls them, hints, that the command to submit is not absolute. For instance, in verse 7 we read, give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honour, then honour. Does that sound familiar? Well, it should do, because it echoes Paul's response to the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 22, verse 21, when we're told he responds to the Pharisees about whether the Jews should pay tax to the occupying Roman authorities. He says, so give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. In New Testament times, the ruler was regarded as a deity, or at least very closely aligned with the God of that region or nation. And so kings and emperors, therefore, were regarded as having divine authority or appointment. Jesus, however, was making it clear that the earthly authorities deserve their taxes, but this did not mean actually paying worship to Caesar. Yes to taxes, but no to unqualified worship. Our worship is reserved for God alone. It is He who we worship. Throughout history, of course, this has set Christian believers up for confrontation when human authorities realize that Christians answer to a higher authority. However, that accountability is to being answerable or accountable to a higher authority cuts both ways. It is not just the Christian who is, but also the governing authorities themselves. For as we see in verse 4, for the one in authority is God's servant for your good. The authorities, the ruler, is a servant and is not free to do what they wish. On this point, I recall some many years ago, where the preacher recalled that a story about our Queen as a young girl, who at a family tea was refused something. So she retorted that she was a princess and could have anything or do anything that she wanted. To which her wise grandfather George V replied, it was precisely because she was a princess she was not free to have her own way. As royalty, she was a servant and accountable, and the king knew it was even more so for any monarch. Governing authorities are accountable to God also. But within this short passage, there are only a couple of hints that the requirement to submit on all occasions is not absolute. However, elsewhere in Scripture, possibly the most notable passage is when Peter in Acts 5:29 responds to the Jewish authorities who order him not to preach the gospel with "we must obey God, not man." The Bible gives a very clear basis for civil disobedience, namely if state commands what God forbids, or God forbids what the state commands, then it is right for us to disobey. And I can think of instances perhaps in Daniel, where Daniel and his 3 friends refused to worship to the statue of Nebuchadnezzar and are thrown into the fiery furnace. Or in Daniel 6, when Daniel refuses to stop praying and to pray and continues to pray to God and not to the king, and then therefore is put into the lion's den. So we are to have clear understanding that we are to disobey if the state commands what God forbids, or God forbids what the state commands. So as followers of Christ, we are to obey God because God is our creator and redeemer, and his word is the ultimate authority. But disobedience to the authority is the exception. As it says in the preceding chapter of this letter, we as Christians are to live by seeking to do things in keeping with God's good, pleasing, and perfect will, Romans 12, verse 2. And also in verses 17 and 18, to be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. So in the knowledge of this, how are we to live? Well, we are to live in a law-abiding submission, so helping authorities maintain society and social order, paying our taxes and respecting authority because the authorities are established by God and hold people to account. I am aware that Philippians 3:20 says that we are citizens of heaven, but that is in relation to being saved and God living in us. But that does not mean that we're exempt from participating in earthly civic life. As Christians, we are to give calm, qualified respect to governing authorities, thereby to respect those in authority, whether they represent our views or not. Secondly, to be calm, so we should not be anxious and fearful over the actions of governing authorities. Why? Because when God allows those who don't worship him to be in power, he does not forget his justice. For instance, King Nebuchadnezzar was a pagan king and was allowed to reign over God's people. But as we read in Jeremiah 27:7, all nations will serve him and his son and his grandson until the time for his land comes. Then many nations and great kings will subjugate him. God's justice would be served in time. Therefore, out of anxiety, we are not to become angry and hostile at authorities, intent on wanting them stopped at all cost. After all, they are God's servant, as it says in chapter 13, verse 4. God is sovereign and in control. We can rest assured his purposes will not be thwarted and authorities will be held to account. And thirdly, in that knowledge that authorities are accountable and under God's judgment, our calm respect is also to be qualified. That is limited and not unquestioning or unconditional. You'll recall that I opened with democracy, and whilst no human system can produce perfect government, we are unfortunate to live in the minority of nations with a true democracy, which, as Churchill noted, is the best form of government. It means we can influence and participate freely, allowing us to proclaim the gospel and not take this for granted. Therefore, as Christians, giving our calm, qualified respect to authorities, we should prayerfully and actively engage with them in accordance with God's word to help them in their God-given role to promote well-being and maintain social order.